6 shadows in the night. One unspeakable act of horror, her screams silenced. Her body left a message. What they did was beyond imagination. But the real question is, who's truly watching whom in the dark? Stay with us till the end, as this twisted tale unfolds with a chilling revelation you'll never see coming. The night was suffocating. Air hung heavy, damp, like a thick blanket smothering every breath. Streetlights flickered, casting pale yellow glows on cracked pavement. A faint buzz, insects swirling around the light, their shadows stretching thin. The street was empty. Not silent, no. There were sounds. The wind whistled between the alleys. Whispers of distant laughter carried through. But no one visible, not at first. She walked briskly, clutching her bag. Fingers trembling, nails digging into the strap. The soles of her shoes scraped on the ground, sharp echoes. Her heartbeat quickened, matching the rhythm of her steps. Ahead, 6 figures emerged from the shadows. Faces cloaked in the night, but their silhouettes, broad shoulders, stiff movements. They moved as one, a swarm closing in. She stopped. Her breath caught, shallow gasps in the dense air. Her eyes darted, left, right. No escape. The figures spread out, circling her. The smallest glimmer, a ring, perhaps flashed on one hand. It caught her eye, distracting her just enough. A hand shot out, rough fingers grazing her wrist. She recoiled, pulling back sharply. "Please." Her voice broke, barely audible. They said nothing, their silence louder than any scream. One step closer. The reek of sweat and something metallic filled her nose. A glint of something sharp, no. Hands, bare hands. Fingers curled, almost claw-like, gleamed under the streetlight. Her vision blurred, panic blooming in her chest. Then the first strike. It wasn't a blade, but it tore like one. A sharp cry, raw, erupted from her throat. Pain bloomed, white-hot and searing. The world tilted, the pavement rushing up to meet her. Her hands grasped at nothing, clawing at air. The voices came then, guttural, laughing, jeering. She tried to scream, to move, but her body betrayed her. A sharp tug, then another. Her stomach felt hollow, a void pulling her insides out. She could smell blood, thick and overwhelming. The pavement slick beneath her, warm and sticky. And the laughter continued, loud, mocking. Above her, the night pressed down, unrelenting. The laughter felt endless. It bounced off the walls, sharp and jagged, cutting through her fading consciousness. Her body trembled, weak spasms rippling through her as if fighting against the inevitable. Her vision dimmed, colors bleeding into shadows. The hands kept working, relentless, tearing at her flesh as if she were nothing more than a rag doll. Her breath came in short, choking gasps. The metallic tang of blood coated her tongue, thick and cloying. Each time she tried to cry out, only a weak gurgle escaped. The pavement beneath her was cold now, a cruel contrast to the warmth of her spilling life. Her ears rang, a high-pitched whine drowning out the jeers. But she could still hear them, faintly mocking, cruel, delighted. "Look at her," one voice growled, rough and guttural. "She's still trying to fight," another sneered, his laughter a serrated edge. Her fingers twitched, desperate to grasp something, anything. But there was nothing, only the void beneath her. The air felt colder now, the warmth draining from her limbs. She tried to lift her head, her neck straining with the effort. The figures loomed over her, shadowed, monstrous, their faces still obscured. One of them knelt closer, his hands dripping crimson. The smell hit her again, raw and feral, mingling with sweat and decay. Her chest heaved, the effort to breathe a torturous labor. The world narrowed, vision tunneling until only their hands remained clear. Fingers slick with her blood, curling, pulling, discarding pieces of her like refuse. She wanted to scream, to plead, to beg. But her voice was gone, swallowed by the night and her pain. A faint light flickered in the distance, but it felt unreachable. The streetlights above buzzed faintly, casting a pale halo over the macabre scene. Her thoughts splintered, fragments of memory flashing before her eyes. Laughter in a park. A warm meal with friends. The scent of flowers on a spring morning. And then, the searing present snapped her back. A new wave of pain erupted, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Her body trembled once more, then began to still. The laughter faded, distant now, as if coming from another world. The night swallowed her whole. The night grew eerily quiet. Their voices, their jeers, became muffled murmurs, distorted in the heavy air. Her body felt weightless, as though she were slipping away from herself. The world around her blurred into an indistinct haze, shadows, light, and the glint of crimson streaks. Her mind drifted, caught between reality and oblivion. The cold pavement pressed against her cheek, grounding her, a final anchor to the world she was leaving behind. One of them knelt beside her again, their breath hot against her ear. "She's almost done," he muttered, his voice low and guttural. The others laughed, their tones tinged with satisfaction. Her gaze flickered, catching movement above. A figure in the distance, a passerby or a phantom pausing in the shadows. Her lips moved, but no sound came. A final plea trapped in her throat, choked by blood and despair. The figure hesitated, their silhouette frozen, as if debating their next move. And then they turned away, fading into the darkness, leaving her alone with the monsters that surrounded her. Her heartbeat faltered, the once rapid thrum now a faint, irregular rhythm. The pain began to dull, fading into a distant ache. Her body no longer hers, no longer feeling. They stood over her now, their work complete. "Let's go," one said, his voice sharp, cutting through the stillness. Another spat on the ground, a dismissive gesture, before they disappeared into the shadows. Their footsteps faded, swallowed by the night, leaving only the echo of their cruelty behind. The street was silent again. The buzzing of the streetlights returned, a monotonous hum that filled the void. Above her, the sky stretched endless and indifferent, its stars faint pinpricks of light. She lay there, motionless, her body a canvas of violence and despair. The world seemed to hold its breath, the weight of her tragedy pressing against the empty street. The faint sound of distant sirens broke through, growing louder, closer. But they were too late, much too late. The sirens wailed, piercing the stillness. Red and blue lights danced on the walls of nearby buildings. The world seemed to jolt awake, its indifference shattered by urgency. A patrol car screeched to a halt, its doors flying open. Two officers stepped out, their faces etched with shock. One staggered back, his hand instinctively covering his mouth. The other froze, staring at the scene in stunned silence. The body on the ground was unrecognizable, a grotesque testament to violence. Blood pooled around her, glistening under the harsh, flickering light. The metallic scent hung heavy, thick and oppressive. "Call it in," the first officer whispered, his voice hoarse. The second fumbled with his radio, his hands trembling. "This is Unit 3, he stammered. "We've got a—" He paused, searching for the words. "A fatality. It's bad." Backup was en route, but the enormity of the moment weighed heavily on them. They crouched beside her, their gloves slick as they searched for any sign of life. A pulse, a breath, anything. But there was none. Her eyes stared blankly, wide and glassy, reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights. The first officer exhaled sharply, his breath fogging in the cold night air. "What kind of monsters?" he muttered, shaking his head. Behind them, curious onlookers began to gather, drawn by the flashing lights. Whispers rippled through the small crowd, a mix of horror and morbid fascination. "Did you see anything?" an officer called out. But the faces in the crowd remained blank, hesitant, unwilling to speak. A woman stepped forward, her hands clutching a scarf to her chest. "I heard screams," she murmured, her voice trembling. "But when I looked—" She trailed off, shaking her head. The officers exchanged glances, frustration simmering beneath their shock. Evidence was sparse, the culprits long gone. The night seemed to close in around them, heavy and suffocating. Her lifeless form lay as a haunting reminder, a question etched into the darkness.
Why?
The crowd thickened, their murmurs blending into a low hum. Cell phones glimmered in trembling hands, capturing fragments of horror. The officers pushed them back, their voices firm but weary. "Step away," one barked, his tone cracking under the strain. A stretcher arrived, carried by two paramedics who hesitated before stepping closer. Their faces betrayed the same disbelief. Carefully, they knelt, their gloves already stained as they worked. One of them began, faltering mid-sentence. The other nodded grimly, finishing the unspoken thought with silence. They moved her body, gently but deliberately, onto the stretcher. The air seemed to grow colder, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. In the distance, more sirens echoed a forensics van, detectives. The scene became a flurry of activity. Yellow tape unfurled, cutting the space into stark lines of authority. But amidst the procedural rhythm, something felt broken. One detective approached, his coat flaring in the sharp wind. His eyes scanned the ground, searching for clues amidst the blood and chaos. Footprints, smudges, anything. His hand brushed against a torn piece of fabric, soaked and ragged. He bagged it, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the area. The victim's belongings lay scattered, a handbag overturned, its contents spilled. Lipstick, a keychain, a small photograph folded at the edges. The image caught his attention. A smiling face, bright and full of life, stared back at him from another time. He turned the photo over, reading the faintly smudged handwriting. "Forever your sunshine," it read. His throat tightened, but he tucked the evidence into a pouch without a word. The crowd murmured louder, speculation giving way to outrage. "How could this happen?" a man demanded, his voice rising above the noise. "Right here, in the open." No one answered. The street seemed to absorb the anger, echoing it back in silence. A stray dog wandered into the scene, sniffing cautiously before being shooed away. Above, the stars dimmed behind gathering clouds, as if turning their gaze from the brutality below. The detective stood, his shoulders heavy with an invisible weight. He didn't need words to know this wasn't the last of it. The scars of this night would linger far beyond the bloodstains. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. The detective tilted his head skyward, letting the chill bite into his skin. It was the kind of night that clung to you, leaving traces long after it was over. He turned back to the scene, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. Most looked away when his gaze met theirs. But one man held his stare, unflinching. The stranger was tall, his hood pulled low over his face. Hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his posture rigid. For a fleeting moment, the detective thought he saw something in the man's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or defiance. But before he could act, the man melted into the crowd, disappearing like a shadow. The detective cursed under his breath, his gut tightening with unease. "Did anyone see him?" He called out, his voice sharp. The crowd murmured, but no one spoke up. The moment passed, swallowed by the growing unease that blanketed the scene. Behind him, the forensic team worked methodically, snapping photos and collecting samples. Every click of the camera felt like a hammer striking steel, harsh and final. One of the techs knelt near a streak of blood leading toward the alley. "It trails off here," she said, pointing toward the darkness beyond the tape. The detective nodded, motioning for a flashlight. He stepped past the tape, the beam of light slicing through the shadows. The alley reeked of damp rot, the walls slick with grime. His footsteps echoed, each one bouncing back louder than the last. The blood trail was faint but steady, leading deeper into the maze of brick and asphalt. He followed it, his breath clouding in the frigid air. A sound stopped him, a faint rustle, like fabric brushing against stone. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his holster. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firm but wary. Silence. Then, a faint glint of something metallic caught his eye. He moved closer, his heart pounding, the light trembling slightly in his grip. A bracelet lay on the ground, delicate and blood-stained. It wasn't hers, he was sure of it. This one was newer, polished, as though it had been dropped in haste. He picked it up, the weight of it sending a chill down his spine. A sudden laugh echoed from the shadows, low, guttural, and unmistakably human. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. The detective tightened his grip on his flashlight, his pulse quickening. Something was watching. Someone. He turned back toward the street, the faint glow of police lights distant now. The laughter stopped, replaced by the soft drip of water from a nearby gutter. The detective exhaled, his breath sharp in the cold. Whatever he was chasing wasn't gone. It was waiting, and it wasn't finished. The detective stepped back into the light of the street, his chest rising and falling with each measured breath. The bracelet dangled loosely from his gloved fingers, its bloodied charm catching the faint glimmer of the streetlight. He looked at it, then back at the scene, at the woman's lifeless body being loaded onto the stretcher, at the faces in the crowd, now muted in their horror. The laughter from the alley lingered in his mind, gnawing at him like a phantom he couldn't shake. He approached the lead forensic officer, his voice low. This was in the alley. He held up the bracelet. "Tag it," the officer said, glancing at it briefly. But the detective didn't move. "This isn't hers," he muttered, almost to himself. The forensic officer paused, looking up sharply. "What makes you so sure?" "Too clean," the detective said, his eyes narrowing. "This was planted. Someone wanted us to find it." The officer's brows furrowed as they scribbled a note on their clipboard. "Who?" "That's the question," he muttered, his voice growing distant. He scanned the crowd again, his eyes sweeping over the shifting faces. Some had left, but a few lingered, silent witnesses unwilling to let the scene go. His gaze stopped on a woman near the back, her face partially obscured by a scarf. She wasn't looking at the crime scene. Her eyes were fixed on him. The detective's stomach churned. Her expression wasn't one of shock or fear. It was calm, calculated. She turned away as soon as their eyes met, disappearing into the crowd without a sound. "Stay here," he barked at the officer, breaking into a brisk stride. He pushed through the sea of bystanders, following the faint outline of her figure weaving through the gaps. His footsteps quickened, the echo of her boots bouncing faintly off the walls. She turned a corner, slipping into the alley where the bracelet had been found. The detective hesitated at the edge, his instinct screaming a warning. The alley stretched ahead, dark and unyielding, the smell of rot thickening. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cutting through the narrow space. But she didn't. Instead, she vanished into the darkness, leaving only the faint rustle of fabric behind. He stepped forward, flashlight trembling in his grip, the world around him pressing in like a vice. The alley was empty. No footprints, no sounds, only the dripping of water and the faint memory of laughter. He turned back, his heart sinking as he realized he was now the one being watched. The alley stretched into a void, the shadows swallowing the faint light from the street behind him. The detective stood frozen, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He turned slowly, his breath shallow, his instincts screaming that he wasn't alone. The night pressed close, the air thick and heavy. From the depths of the alley, there was a sound of faint scrape, like nails on stone. It was deliberate, slow, as though whoever or whatever was there wanted him to hear. "Show yourself," he barked, his voice echoing off the damp brick walls. Silence followed, oppressive and absolute. Then a figure emerged. Not the woman he had chased, but someone else. A man stepped forward, his face half lit by the faint beam of the flashlight. His expression was calm, his eyes dark, emotionless pools. He wore a faint smirk, his hands stuffed casually into his pockets. "You're persistent," the man said, his voice low and smooth. The detective's hand hovered near his holster, his pulse pounding. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, the light catching a streak of blood on his sleeve. "You're looking for answers," the man said finally. "And I can give them to you, but only if you're willing to follow." The detective stiffened, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Follow where?" The man's smirk widened, his teeth flashing briefly in the dim light. "Into the truth," he said, his voice dripping with menace. Before the detective could react, the man turned and walked deeper into the alley. His footsteps echoed faintly, fading into the darkness. The detective hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stop. But something pulled him forward: curiosity, defiance, or maybe the faint hope of justice. He stepped into the shadows, each footfall heavy with doubt. The alley twisted and turned, the light from his flashlight growing weaker with each step. The air grew colder, the walls pressing closer. And then it opened into a vast, empty lot. The man stood in the center, waiting. Around him, 6 other figures emerged, their faces obscured, their movements deliberate. The detective's stomach churned. He recognized the stillness in their posture, the eerie calm. It was them, the ones who had torn her apart. The man in the center smiled again, spreading his arms wide. "Welcome to the end," he said softly. The detective reached for his weapon, his heart racing. But before he could draw, the lights flickered, then went out completely. The darkness swallowed him whole, leaving only the faint echo of laughter behind.